saying if I could find that, I did the jQuery, that's like 5 green, I was not going to clear over every time I change that slider, nothing happens.
Yeah, are you getting an error?
I probably am.
If nothing happens, first thing you do is see if there's an error.
I don't
It's always a good idea.
Well, that was what I was trying to
Okay, so I don't think any of this.
It's a lot of fun. You can waste a lot of time out waiting. But you can certainly look up the clock and go, where are those 3 hours
into the value.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's good. Okay. I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're trying to do, but anything could be done. Anything could be done. Let me just get my...
So how much do you take off
the first assignment probably, it depends on the, the nature of the errors and all that, but never more than 1 point for JavaScript. It's like spelling.
So I have a version out here. I have 3 versions. This is the 4 version. That's not inside. My that's the best
It's like a vernacular, really more than anything. Do you understand what I'm saying? Things still work. So there's English and there's all sorts of vernaculars of English. And what we're saying is, it uses vernacular so we could understand what you're saying. You know? If you speak like you're from South Carolina in this class, I'm not going to understand you. Or from South Africa, you know, if you use their slang, I'm not going to understand. So I'm not sure it's 100% the best analogy, but it's kind of like that. So did I start the recording?
There's nothing there.
Yes.
That's what they were doing. Oh yeah. So what I did is I said inquire and put in there, so I didn't have to do it.
And the other thing is more there was training and taking out special characteristics. You're going to have to do this stuff.
Take out what?
If you're going to catch up to the thing that was really closer to the data using other structures.
7 or 6. This is 6.
So if you're going to filter it, you'll filter directly.
Is that where we're doing the script, the extra line, or spaces and everything?
Okay, we guys ready to start? It's 5:30. Seems kind of quiet in here today. Must be the heat wave. Kind of quiet home. A few people home. All right, well, we'll get started. And if you could turn that on, that would be great. So let's see, where are we? We're in week number 7. The last week we had no class, so yeah, we're in week number 7. And we're, next week is the midterm, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Midterm, probably about maybe 20 questions. Somewhere between 10 and 20. It'll be worth 10 points, right? 10, 20, no. 10, 20. Yep, it says it right here.
10 points.
It is worth 10 points, yeah. So it might be 20 questions, somewhere between 10 and 20. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a lot harder than the quizzes. No, I'm joking. But it'll, it'll be everything we covered and nothing. And it's, no hidden stuff. So, quiz 2, everyone should have taken that. There are a few stragglers. It's open now if you didn't take it. If you want to take it just for grins. There was one short answer question that everyone might have not have gotten an immediate right answer because I can only have one right answer, and there's a couple of ways you can answer that. So you should have all gotten credit.
You get element ID?
Yeah, I mean, I've gone in and you should have all gotten credit. If you didn't get credit for that, let me know. But check before you let me know because I went in and gave you credit after the fact. Just because the CAPE system for short answers doesn't have multiple possibilities. So I wish I would have known that before I created a short answer. Question?
I thought I had heard something that made me clear that you can take it more than once.
You can take it more than once, but if you haven't taken it yet and you want to take it, you can.
Oh, okay, so you can.
I think you could take it as many times as you want, but you only get credit for the first time. For the first, yeah, I believe. Yeah.
Good try.
Yeah, you could take it as many times to get the highest credit, and that would be like my gerbil could do that. So okay, so any questions from home? No. So I have we're going to go through a couple of topics today in the context of Project 4, and one of them will be events, and one of them will be sort of at a little bit more of a higher level, and I'm sure there'll be other topics that pop up. But before we get started in that, anybody have any questions in general about the class? I mean, not about, something about events, because we're going to get there. Anything other than events, let's say. I have a question for you guys, including the people at home, but there's not that many people, and they might join later. And I'm not sure. If you're listening to the archive, you could send me an email, but this is sort of a rhetorical question. So we're about almost halfway through this semester, and this is not an introduction to programming class. However, a lot of the topics we covered sort of played part of that role. And my question to you is this: do you think it's feasible that a community college such as the JC can offer an introduction to programming class using a language like JavaScript or maybe Python or something else? It doesn't matter. But offer that in an 8-week time frame, or would it be more meaningful in a 16-week time frame?
And then you say after the 8 week, I think 16 weeks.
Yeah, and you can, and we have something now called CS10, which is an introduction to computer programming. And it's 3 credits, and it is 16. Yeah. So, but just something to think about, because we are thinking of offering something that would be sort of a porch to that class, this class, and other classes, where some of these common, for loops and other concepts are talked about. And I'm already hearing 16 weeks would be preferable, but you have some time to think about it. And if you're at home, you can think about it over the break, although we're getting feedback right now, so that's good. So, and it sounds like people have opinions about this, so that's good.
Would you offer an advanced class that would be 16 weeks after that?
We would still have CS10, and we would still have this JavaScript class.
Well, CS10 is really about the introduction to C++.
Yeah, so I think we would still have other programming languages classes, but I'm not sure we would have a, there's CS11, which could be a, So I think the purpose of this is we teach the same concepts in a lot of classes. If you take the PHP class, you'll learn what a for loop is, and what a variable is, and what a function is. And if you take C++, you'll learn that. If you take JavaScript, you'll learn that. If you take, is there a way we can
compress it into one class?
Yeah, teach these at a conceptual level. And my question to you really is, do you see that working better as a 16-week full 3 credit type of thing, or? Okay, now we've kind of done that. Now some of you didn't know these concepts going into this class. We're 7 weeks into this class, and we've gone over most of what you need to know. You know what an object is. You know what a function is. You know what an event is. You know what a variable is. You know what a data type is. You know what a for loop is. And so that's why I'm asking you this question.
Well, I would respond to what I'm understanding you saying. If you did a generic introduction to programming, is what you're saying.
Right.
It doesn't address any particular language. It talks about the for loops, the variables, and that
I mean, you have to have a language to do it, or else it doesn't work. But yeah, but something simple like JavaScript that has a low barrier to entry. You know, you don't need a lot of
Well, I think
browser.
you would have to be able to touch all the languages a little bit to stay, try to come up with some of the other tips.
Yeah, no, I'm not the department chair. I don't have a lot of say in the curriculum here. But I'm teaching this class, and I'm thinking, in just a half a semester, a lot of you are getting all of these functions in the context of JavaScript. So that's just why some of you have used these concepts before, I agree.
Would that change the structure of the other classes if you had that?
I don't know. This is just something we're saying. And I just say this is not a beginner's class. You can use that's true, Cal, but in this class, I'm trying to teach these concepts as if they were new.
Right.
And that's the point. And I'm trying to teach, there's an advantage that they're not new to a lot of you, and it helps sometimes. But I've tried to approach it as you could take this class not have ever knowing what a variable was, And here we are 7 weeks in, and you kind of know most of those concepts. Now, do you know them well enough to be ready for CS10? I don't know. Maybe not.
To take this class, you would be required to have another class for the basic concepts.
Yeah, so I don't know where this class would fit into curriculum and all that, and I'm just looking for general, ideas and feedback. But the general feeling I'm getting is you see this as a full semester. Yeah, we're trying to. Part of this is we're trying to fix it. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it took me 3 classes. So, I don't know, it took me 3 classes over 5 years to get what a function is. Yeah, so there's different approaches, you're right. Okay. But you are fast. I understand, but you are fast. I do. Okay, so, all right, guys. So, let's get started. Filling up a little bit online and filling up a little bit here in this class where the temperature's going up. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So thanks for your feedback. And if you have more ideas, you could send me an email, and I'll try to figure out how to collect that. So let's talk about this class again. So today we are going to spend a fair amount of time talking more about events because the project we're going to work on, Project 4, is very much an event-oriented project. As is a lot of JavaScript, a lot of the ways in which we use JavaScript. So we're going to get a little deeper into events, and that's good because there's been a lot of very good questions on the forums. I don't know if you watched those on the pages, but there's been a lot of pretty good questions about events. And most of them should be covered by the topics and techniques we'll discuss today. The other thing we're going to try to do in going through Project 4, as opposed to Project 3, is to take, and Project 4 is already up there, it's a calculator widget, and you can see it and play it and see the code and all that, is we're going to try to take a little bit more of the how do I go about this perspective than what do I do perspective. Project 2 and Project 3 to some degree were sort of like IKEA projects, take this code and put it together. Project 3 said, now that you got it working, put a shelf on or whatever. Project 4, we're going to try to, as we go through the walkthrough, we're going to try to say, what thinking led us to build this thing this way? Because our job here is not just to learn how to build a JavaScript widget that we bought at IKEA, but maybe to design some furniture ourselves, right? And if we don't get to do that, just knowing what it takes to design a desk or a calculator is a good, it's a good mental approach and a good thing to do. Even if you say, that's a lot, it's a good idea. It's a good idea to go through this. So like all of our projects, they're sort of semi-optional. You don't have to do 100% of our projects. We'll have more than 6, which is what you'll be great on. And this one is probably as programming oriented as we're going to get. Projects going forward will get more into DOM and jQuery, and there'll be more programming techniques. So I won't say this is the most sophisticated, but it's probably one where we tried to focus on how do you go about thinking about building and programming a project. So those 2 things, how do events work and how do we kind of approach something we're trying to do. So the project is pretty straightforward. Put a calculator on a web page that can do basic arithmetic, right? 965 plus 10 is equal to 975. So basic calculator functionality built into the web page. No Flash, no, nothing outside of HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And one of the things that makes this project really cool is you really will get to see those layers that we talked about earlier in the semester. HTML for presentation and structure. CSS for style and layout. And JavaScript for behavior. Right, so we'll really see how those interplay. There's been a couple of, we've talked a lot about objects and some of the theory behind, how you program to create things that you're going to use as an object and instantiate. And we've heard a couple of people say, functional programming is a slightly different and maybe more interesting approach with JavaScript. If you look at this project, it's very much, it's built around a functional approach. It's a good example of a JavaScript project. It's very event-oriented. Every piece of behavior is tied to a button, right? So it's very event-oriented. And every piece of behavior is tied to the button that's being clicked. The user's expectations is very set for these buttons. We know what they are. What we're going to do now is encapsulate that into JavaScript code, right? But the point I'm making is when we're looking at the functional design for this project, we really have to look at each thing and say, okay, what happens when somebody clicks this? And there is, there are some conditions. What happens if somebody clicks this either before or after they click one of these? So we do have some logic in there, but essentially at the core of it is a bunch of things waiting to happen and a bunch of behaviors that we have somewhere that we're going to hook up to what happens or wire up, using events of course, to what happens to get the behaviors that we want, which is basic, simple arithmetic. So, any questions about that? We'll learn some new techniques, and I won't go into that in detail until we get into it. But I think the point at this point is that that you should look at this project as a very typical JavaScript project and a very event-driven and functionally driven sort of design. Let's see. So let's go through this. So really all you need, this page happens to have Bootstrap on it. It's not required for this project. It looks a little bit better with it. But like in our other projects, you could literally just take, if you want to follow along, you could literally just take the code, and as people have said, the best way I can go through this is to kind of copy and paste and explain, right? So let's go through that. I'm going to use Dreamweaver as my editor. I already have an HTML page. And obviously in the body element, I am going to paste that element, which is basically a div wrapping another div and a table. Right? And both of the divs and the table have IDs, and every element within the table has a class. Well, every cell, not the rows, right? And they're classed based on their generic function. Does that make sense? So there's IDs for the specific things, like the whole widget, right? But for a number button, all we are telling the structure right now is that it's a number button. So it's it's class by class. That's, I guess, what you could say. So we differentiate between number buttons and operator buttons, and a couple of special buttons, enter and clear. Right. Enter, so IDs, enter, and ID clear. Sorry, yeah, good point. I should always highlight so people can see. So, questions at home? I am going to save this document. I'll just I'm just going to call it index in a folder called calc. You could call it whatever you want. Okay. So let's go back to our project page. And essentially here is just a bunch of style definitions based essentially either on one of the IDs that we defined or an element within the ID. It's going to copy that. You could put it in a style thing for now if you want. I think it's probably better just to put it in a CSS definition. I mean a CSS file. And in the head of the document, obviously, you'd want to, in Dream, well, let's do it like this. What is it? Href? And what is it? Right. Do that, and if I get rid of this, and should find that file, right? Give it a minute. Dreamweaver. Go to my window, files, and there should be like a refresh. Anyway, call the calc, right? Yeah, it should be out there. All right. So let's get our Java. Let's start with our JavaScript file. So let's create a. There it is. Yeah. Let's create a new file for our JavaScript. I'm just going to call it calc.js. And get rid of that. And here I could go, let's do this at the bottom of the page. It's getting hot in here, huh? Okay, so, and that should pull that in. That might take a minute or two. So, so at this point, if we look at our page, this is where I always have to bring it up in Chrome. If we look at it, let's say in Firefox at this point, we have a calculator. So this is the point I was making, right? We have content, we have structure, we have style, we have layout, but we don't have behavior, right? So in this case, we have a clear sort of line between the behavior that's added by the widget and the interface that's added by the HTML elements and the style elements that, in this case, some of the style elements might belong to the widget, and some of the elements on the page might be of a type needed by the widget, but there's a separation between them. There's no behavior on the page itself, right? It'll all be in the JavaScript. So what I want to do there is look at it in Chrome probably. Okay, so let's think a little bit about what we're trying to do, right? The first thing you would ask is, okay, what is the spec, right? What kind of calculator is this? Is this a scientific calculator? Does it do exponents? You know, does it? So given the buttons we have, we could kind of make up our spec now. And what we're going to say is that, one, there's no operation beyond plus, well, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Those are the operations that are available. There's no negative numbers, because although we have a minus, we have a subtraction operator, we have no way of entering a negative number, at least for the purposes of this project. And there's no decimal point. So this calculator only works in whole numbers, right? So that's in general our spec. The behavior is pretty typical. You enter a number, an operand, let's say. You enter an operation, you enter a second operand, and then you get the answer by clicking equals, right? There is no third operand or second operation, at least for the purposes of what we're going to do in this class. Might be part of the project, right? You can see that at the bottom. The result could be decimal as a result of a division, right? Yeah, yeah. But you can't input it. You can only input whole numbers, right? And you can't get a fraction from it. You know, you will get a decimal returned, obviously, from a non-whole number result. Right? So user loads the calculator, presented with a 0. User enters one or more digits. So as I said, you enter an operand, you enter an operation, you enter an operand. However, an operand needs to be able to have either one digit or multiple digits, obviously. Right? That's part of the spec, right? Part of what you would ask before, taking on this project, because it's something you have to think about. Right? User will then enter an operator. So one of the things is, how big could the number be? At this point, let's not worry too much about that. You enter an operator. You enter a second operand, which could be one or more digits. You then press the Enter key, and the calculator displays the results. Right? And you could clear it at any time, right? So there needs to be a clear function. is basically our spec for this code, right? And then for the project, for the assignment around this project, after we go through this walkthrough, there's a bunch of stuff that you can do to add on to it, right? So,
Did you add some JavaScript already to one page?
I have not done anything. Yeah, there's no JavaScript on here.
You had a
As far as I know, it was
insert in your HTML page at the bottom.
well, all I did was refer to the JavaScript source file, but there's no JavaScript in it yet. Does that make sense? So yeah, I think my statement was still right. There's no JavaScript that I've added yet, but there is a script tag, which is really HTML. But yeah, and this line of code and this line of code are not in the example project page. Does that make sense? So you can name those files what you want and link to them how you want. We just didn't do that. In the project page, the HTML is just the structure. Make sense? Okay. So, let's think about how we go about designing this, right? Like I said, this, if you think about this, I guess the best way to do it is just stare at kind of the blank slate. And if you, like I said, if we could look at it in here, actually, because it might look a little nicer. But if you do it with, all you have to do is add the Basecamp CSS, and it'll show up like that, I think. So, like I said, everything is sort of based. I'm sorry? I meant to say Bootstrap. Sorry. Did I say Basecamp?
Yes.
Wow. It's pretty bad. Bootstrap CSS. So, so as I said, the best way to approach this is to say, what are we doing? We're adding behavior, and we're adding behavior to things that are already visually implemented. So essentially, it doesn't take, you probably know enough from what we learned already in this class is you want to get a handle on the elements, and you want to then get some behavior implemented on an event by that element. Usually an on-click event, I think, in all cases, with the possible exception of the one spec that says the enter key. Click the enter key to get the result. So that might not be an on-click, that might be a key result. Right? We'll look at that. Right? Let's see if that works on this page. 3 times 3. Yeah, so right now we're using this as the enter key. Right? But the spec says the enter key. So maybe we should change that to equal something, right? So anyway, so like I said, the first thing we're going to do, and if we go through here in steps, the first thing we're going to do is get handles on what we have available to us, the elements on the page, so that we could then add our functionality to events that are functions that happen when the user interacts with those elements of the page, right? So, and most of this should be somewhat familiar to you, right? First thing we do in the JavaScript code is define variables that refer through the JavaScript namespace to the page elements that are on the page, that are there by the HTML, right? And we do learn a few new functions here, right? Some new DOM functions, right? This one should be familiar to us. Everyone should know how to spell that by now, right? I certainly do. And everyone got it. I don't think there may be one spelling thing. So, which is great.
Use jQuery for this project?
You could definitely use jQuery for this project. And this is sort of our entry level to jQuery. Because this function, which is built into the DOM and all browsers at the JavaScript level, is sort of how jQuery works. which is using CSS selectors to get handles on your page elements, your DOM elements, right? And you could do that either with the call that's going to return, obviously, an array, or you could do that, because here, what are you using? You know, you guys know this, right? It's CSS, right? This class, and this is an ID. And this will return, let us return an array, right? If this returns an array, then, I mean, you don't know this just by looking at it, but it's going to return the first element that is a match, right? And if we can look these up in, you know, Mozilla or, yeah, let's see, W3 Schools. So, and returns the first element within the document that is a match of that selector, right? So what we're looking at here is a method that is a member of what? What is controls? So getElementById is a method of what object? It says it right here. The document object, right? So controls is an instance of a part of that document, and we now see that the DOM, the document object, also has these other methods. Not just getElementById, getElementsByClass, getElementsByTagName. It also has querySelectorAll and querySelector. And those allow you to use CSS notation in strings to come up with a way of getting handles on page elements in a way that may be a little bit more familiar to people who know CSS, and maybe a little bit more flexible to people who design HTML structures in a smart way. Because what are we doing? You know, we're getting at our elements in a specific way for those that have specific behaviors, and then we're getting handles to the elements that we're going to apply generic behaviors to by referring to them generically. In other words, why are we doing this? Because ultimately we want to write one function that can work regardless of what button you press, and hopefully even one function that could apply to whatever operator you press. Because the zen and the art of functional programming design is to write functions that can be genericized, that can work for the most possible cases. That's how you write the least possible code, right? You want to so you don't want to have an event handler for the number 3 and another event handler for the button that has the number 4 on it. You want an event handler that says, do this if a number is pressed, and figure out what number was pressed when that happens. Not quite. Yeah, it's not really analogous to prototypes, but the analogy is that they both are trying to approach things in a generic manner to make them apply to as many cases as possible. So in object-oriented programming, you would put that function on the prototype because every instance of that prototype would have the same behavior. Like our slideshow. We had the next, or whatever it was in our slideshow, I think it was called cycle. We put that at the prototype because all slideshows cycle. Right? Does that make sense? And then anything that we instantiated as a new slideshow had that behavior, inherited that behavior of cycle. In this case, yeah, you're right. In many ways, we're using the CSS selectors to get a way of getting handles on a set of objects that are going to share a lot of their behavior. And then we're going to have an event that is able to resolve, okay, which specific one was that? And how do I behave? You know, how do I do a 3 instead of a 4? Because even though they're both numbers, they represent different values or different things.
Why are we calling it number rather than button number?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we could be more specific and say button dot number. Or we could be even more specific and say body space button dot number. Or we could be even more specific and say body space div dot whatever it was. So here we're being as generic as possible, and it might not be a smart way of doing that because there might be other elements on this page, that are doing other things that happen to be classed with numbers. So you're right.
But you're actually calling the class button number, BTN number, on the image.
Yeah. So.
Very logic to make naming your ID and very similar name as your variable in JavaScript. It just keeps it straight. There's no problem there, right?
There is no problem with that. Yeah, they're different names. They represent different things.
I know, but they should. I would think that one is the same as the other, so your name would stay.
Yeah, I mean, there's naming conventions, and a lot of people like to use buttons, so now that you're in a variable what you're referring to. Some of this is the nature of the program and what you're doing. Is it a good idea to always refer to them in the same name? Maybe, maybe not.
I just combined the two. If I found I want a button in my JavaScript, I just put it back in HTML. So if I wanted the button reference, I just put it in both places. Then I would never have to guess, which is this? Right? If you have an ID for an element and you're just trying to get a handle on it in JavaScript, why not name them exactly the same?
They might have different purposes. It depends on what you're doing.
Okay.
They're not always analogous to what. So, and I'm not sure I understand your question 100%. Is it why aren't these names exactly equal to these names? Like these are?
Display is element by ID display. That makes sense. But you go down to number buttons, and it is query select all dot number. Why would you use query dot number button?
If you look at the HTML for a sec,
Oh.
the class is actually BTN number.
Oh, yeah. So,
So it catches.
well, it's classed with two classes. These are two different classes. This is not a class named button number. So this element is classed with a value of BTN, and also has a class of NUMBR number. Does that make sense? So, yeah, I wasn't sure, and I'm not sure I still answered your question. And we're talking about convention, not right or wrong, but in this case, they might not always be analogous. So here we're talking about the group of buttons. Well, anyway, let's move on. So the takeaway here are these two new functions, and the way we could refer to them refer to page elements using selectors, using the same syntax as CSS. And this is essentially a big part of what jQuery does. jQuery is built on the fact that every statement starts with a selector. That looks just like this. What do you want to do? But before you get to that, what do you want to do it to? And then what do you want to do? So it's kind of subject predicate type of thing. So anyway, at this point, all we're doing here, so what is operator capital B TNS? Given that this is defined here in JavaScript, and given that this is the HTML that it's attached to. So it is is it a page element? Yeah, it's an array. It's a variable of type array, which is really a collection of page elements, DOM objects, objects of the DOM. So,
I mean, how do you know it's an array?
you're right. We don't. If there are no elements on the page with a class of dot operator, we know that there are because we looked up here and there's 2 right here, 3, 4. So we did know that. It was part of the given. But we know it because this class, let's go over here, That class is part of the DOM. We didn't write that function. It's a method of the document object. And if you look it up, never use something that you don't know what it's going to do. You know what I mean? I happen to know, and I'm showing you where you look it up. But if you look it up, it'll say, I'm not sure I clicked on the best link. Here. Returns a list of the elements. The object return is a node list. So it's really an object collection. But as we know, arrays and objects are pretty synonymous in JavaScript. You can navigate both using index. What do I mean by that? You can navigate either using index notation. Does that make sense? So even though it's not an array, you could still refer to it syntactically as if it was.
So it's going to fill it with the plus and the minus and star.
It's going to fill it with the plus, and it's going to fill it with the elements that represent that. Yeah. So that's a good question. So let's do this. Let's go back here and grab this and put it in our page. And save that. And let's take a look at, let's say, this. Copy this. And if we go here and go to our console and reload this, and if we type in that variable, I think we could see that we get a, what do we get? We get an array of these page elements.
Those are different buttons on the page.
These are, yeah. So the way the console displays it is that it shows us a sense of the text values of those nodes. It knows it's a collection of nodes, and it presents it to you in a way that you could read it. Right? It doesn't just say object, 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 but they are objects. It just. Oh, sure it does. Yeah, there's plus. Right? Yeah. So and it'll show you even on, it'll show you right on the page where they are. It's kind of cool. So does that answer? Whose question was this? Mark, your question?
Well,
Mark,
my
right?
question is, I'm looking at this. Operator BTN doesn't really identify the code.
So one question you have is, why is there only one var? And then, we're using one var keyword to define multiple variables. And they're separated by commas. So you might not have seen that syntax before. It's shorthand syntax.
I'm looking at the short.
JSLint likes that stuff, actually.
So recognized by the dot operator.
But here, this dot operator is saying, go query, run this method on this object. And this object is essentially the controls, everything that sits in this element here. And
okay, so it's going to run through and everything that has the dot operator or the operator
class. Anything that has an operator class is going to be part of the array or that node list that is represented in this program by the variable name operator BTNS.
Gotcha.
Make sense? This is basically just like this. We're using a slightly different syntax. The functions change slightly, and they're a little bit more familiar in how you reference them. You don't have to, if you know CSS, it should be more familiar. And you could use a more generic function. You don't have to remember, was that get element by tag name, and was it a capital N, and what was the, so, and is tag name a B, or a body, or an A, or an anchor, you know what I mean? So this makes it very simple.
This need for those jail and get elements and maybe it's sort of like, you're doing this, I just did on social media, and you're dropping some script, they out, you sort of got it set up your area. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, that's essentially what you're doing here. So what are we doing here? Let's take a step back. So anything we do in programming, we're going to try to do, it's like being, you know, I don't want to get into philosophy, but it's kind of like Plato in the cave, right? When you're a programmer, you try to build a model representation of the real world, and then by manipulating that model, you give a tool for somebody to use. So, you know, are we programming the real number 3? No, we're just programming a button that represents that 3 to the user. And we're wiring that up to a variable that we can now work with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In this case, we're doing something kind of special. We have one variable that refers to all operators and another variable that refers to all numbers, or all elements that represent those numbers.
Because I'm used to just, you know, a program, you know, and the program just, you know, write a function, right? You know, you write the variables, this kind of function. But here, it's more dynamic.
You're still going to, so let me try to answer your question. You're still writing a program. However, part of your program universe includes the web browser and the document that's loaded on the web browser. And
You just need to be able to address that.
it's part of your program. It's in your space, whether you like it or not,
Yeah.
because you're using JavaScript. Your JavaScript is in its space. It's not that it's invading your space. You're writing JavaScript in that page, right? You don't have to. You could write it in another world. You could write it in Node.js, which doesn't have a document or a window,
Because I'm thinking,
right?
you know, what I want to think is, you could just skip the 2 gate output and just say controls clear select for all. Because controls, well, it's already CSS, right?
It's not. No.
Skip that.
But just because something is in HTML, JavaScript can't see it until you get a handle to it. You have to get a handle to it because in JavaScript you're dealing with the object that is the shadow on the wall of the cave of the actual page element. Make sense? You're not messing around with the button. You're messing around with a variable that in the JavaScript space enables you to mess around with that element. That JavaScript element, by the magic of the DOM, actually has properties that inject behavior right into the page element. So it's kind of tricky, but that's because all of these things are part of your program. The document itself is an object that's loaded in your program. You just can't refer to it unless you get a handle to it using a JavaScript variable. Right? So, any questions at home? Any questions out here? Okay. So, this should make sense at this point. This is really very little new, other than these 2 functions, like I said. And they're very, you know, they're not a lot of new behavior. They work essentially the same. They just work slightly differently. So, I could have used getElement by ID. In fact, I could have used getElement by class name. And it's almost synonymous with this dot. Right? I'm trying to teach you probably a more effective way of doing it. Number 1. Number 2, it's a good introduction to what we're going to learn next, which is jQuery, which then builds on this model to sort of take these selectors and add a whole library of methods to them, right? And that's kind of like what jQuery core is. So, not part of this class. To answer your question, you could do this assignment in jQuery if you want. But at this point, we're just learning these 2 new methods, which are supported in every browser. Okay. Next, so all the variables we defined here, as we've already said, represent something on the page, some physical node in the document. These are easy. You know, we didn't have to give a lot of thought. Everything that can be pressed, I've got to figure out what happens when I press it. The only thought I gave to this so far is, I'm going to hope that when I write my functions, for when number is pressed and operator is pressed, that I can write them generically enough that I could get by with one function for each of those. Right? We'll get to that later. The next thing I got to think about when I'm designing this thing is, are there any variables, are there any data things that I need to keep in mind in this program that aren't page elements? I want to define them now. Why do I want to do that? Because J makes me use this JS lint thing, and if I don't define them up front, it's going to give me an error. So that's one reason. The other reason, it's not a bad practice to say, what am I trying to do, and what data might I need to hold in the course of this project to keep track of what's going on. So why do we want to keep, obviously some of these things are pretty straightforward. This represents what? You don't know? Yeah, it represents the answer. It is not the element that contains the answer on the page. It's the variable that contains the value, hopefully, of the answer. We don't know that yet, but you guys that are smart see where we're going. That's what we're going to use that as a placeholder for what is the current answer to the problem. And it will, therefore, if I start out as 0, people expect a calculator when it goes on, if it has batteries, to show one of those green zeros, and it probably will change in the course of the working of the process of the specification, right? Remember the specification, enter an operand, enter an operator, enter an operand, get a result. So this display has to change state as we do.
All the time, you couldn't use calculators in school.
You couldn't use
Calculators.
calculators, right?
There
Right.
were calculators.
Yep.
Did anybody get taught how to use the slide rule?
That's what we use.
I still have a slide rule. I won't talk about how old I am, but so anyway. So that's a good point. So this calculator project, extra credit if you do it as a slide rule. Fair? That supports sine, cosine, tangent. Yeah. Okay, and all that is in JavaScript built in to the math object. So it would be kind of a cool project. I'll give you 2 projects if you do that. You got to be a real nerd to know how a slideshow works these days. But you the slide rule. Yeah, slideshow we already did. Okay, so again, these are working variables, and if we go through here, obviously, like I said, we're going to need variables that represent what we're doing. Once the first operand is entered, it's going to leave the display. Well, we got to remember it, right? You got to put it somewhere. So this is working. This is what we used to call in COBOL programs the working storage area. Right? You have to define all your variables in a variable section, and those. Remember that? So this is the working. Okay. You get 3 projects if you do this in COBOL and get it to display on a web page. So maybe we'll use COBOL for that intro to programming class we talked about. So anyway, again, working storage is a good way to think about this. What variables might I need as a result of solving this problem, or better yet, representing the solving of this problem in the course of the problem, right? And we might not get them all here, and some of these are pretty basic, like, these we've seen again and again. Iterators always require that iteration number, the current iterator, and as we saw with JS links, even though the for statement in JavaScript doesn't require you to the pre-var the length, JS link gives you a hard time if you do. So everything in this example, before you get started with it, is JS link compliant.
Well, not that JS link stuff. I mean, if close good enough.
What?
I mean, I use underscore.js. I hate that.
Yeah, so is close good enough? It depends on who's grading. So I'm not joking.
I'm not going to give up the use of a great library just because JS doesn't like something about it.
And there are things that it kind of doesn't want you to do sometimes that might be a good technique to use. So I'm a little flexible, but I do think it is a good practice to understand it and how it works, and understand in general its purpose, and understand how easy it makes it for me and no one to grade your projects. If you at least, white space things up in a way that.
I'm okay if I make it easy to read, but I just don't want to give up a library who's always complaining about my choice of library.
Yeah, and that's fine, but the other thing is don't let your libraries get in the way of the projects either. You know what I mean? Like you've got a lot of code on your page, and which is good. I mean, it all works, and but it makes it hard for me to find what you wrote and what you don't. So I'm just pointing out somebody you don't have to know who that is.
I look at the code, but I'm telling you that.
Yeah, but it's all like libraries. No, not all of it. I mean, you do some good stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was trying. I went, whoa.
Yeah. Yeah, and it has nothing to do with the assignment, really. It's great stuff.
The AJAX page to put the assignment in, they should be fairly separate. So all
Yeah,
that
yeah.
is, separate.
Okay, so at this point we've essentially, what have we done? Design-wise, we said we know what the spec is. We know because everyone knows this because we all went to school in the 20th century. We know what a calculator looks like, and to some degree how people expect it to behave. We painted a calculator on a web page. As we start to do the behavior, before we get into the behavior, we just kind of said, what pieces of data do we need for the behavior to work on? See what I'm saying? And the first set of that is, what comes with this page that we need to get a handle on to interact with? Some of those will have events attached to them that the behavior will work on that. Some of them, like this, it's not going to have an event as much as it's going to be a place where events send information, right? Does that make sense? Well, this will be the place where events send their information, and ultimately it'll get into that display. But essentially, the point to think of at this point is, as we're designing this thing, kind of like I said before, we're going from IKEA to sort of becoming carpenters. Before we start putting the thing together with the directions, do we have all the pieces of wood we need? Does that analogy make sense? The variables are the pieces of wood. Do we have the drawers? Do we have the, what I mean? Do we have the glue? Do we have the nails and all that? And at this point, we might not have it all. We might need to run up to true value or something, but we've tried to think of all the data elements we might need to interact and put the behavior behind that simple calculator, right? So as you go through this, no matter what the next project is, it might be, build a spaceship that goes from one web page to the next. You might start thinking about this. I might not say, start with building this function. You know what I mean? We might move into, how do I go about doing this? And you'd say, okay, first, what information or what data elements do I need? What parts do I need? And then how do I manipulate those parts to get what I'm trying to do? So at this point, we've got our bill of materials. We've got our list. Our variables that either represent things that we're going to manipulate or are working storage for things that we're in the process of manipulating as part of the process that this calculator is going to go through. That process is pretty simple. Operator, operand, result. Right? It doesn't have a lot of room for error. If you try to get a result before you do all that, it's just going to sit there and not do anything. It's going to avoid your behavior, right? So, so now we're ready to move into the behavior, right? We're ready to go like, okay, what steps do we need to think about for this thing to have the behavior that it needs to do what we want it to do in that spec? And this, I would say, is the heart of what most JavaScript programmers spend their time thinking about. How do I design the functions in a way that makes them generic enough that I do as little coding as possible, right? Like I said before, we don't want to have an event on every number doing the same thing. If you click 3, add 3. If you click 4, add 4. We want to try to think of a way to write one function that does addition, and one that just takes a number input, right? And another one that, does division, not based on what number you've entered, but just does division on any number, right? So, so the functional model is sort of the important part of this, and this is the list for this example that we came up with for the specs for the way we design this program, right? There might be better ways to design it. In fact, there probably are. but we try to leverage, like I say, some common behaviors, right? So as we implement these, we'll learn a little bit more what these are, but it's probably a good time just to go through and see, what these will do. So update display. Update display is that wiring of take the variable that represents the current value that is expected by the user and put that in that element so it's visible. And you want to do that a couple of times, right? We said this before. When you enter the first number, you want that first number to be there. And then when you enter a plus, you might want a plus sign to be there to give them feedback. Then when you enter the second number, you want the second number to be there, and then when you enter equal, you want the result to be there, right? So update result is already 4 different things. But if you think about it backwards, all 4 of those things do essentially the same thing at the end of it, which is take whatever number they come up with and put it into the display element. So in this case, we said, why not put that in a separate function, since more than one thing is going to do it. When you divide, you want to update the display. When you put a new number in, you want to update the display. When you put a new digit in, you want to update display. When you hit the equal sign, so all of those update display, let's create an update display function and see if we can make that work for all those cases, right? And in this case, we could, because we don't really care what it's displaying. Let the function tell it what to display. All we're doing is wiring it up to where we want it to go on the page.
Challenge. Make the display be a tape.
That's another great project. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, like a tape. Yeah. So you can use it for your check deposits. When you're adding up all your checks.
Tell you what you get.
All your landlord and rentals you can do. So like Quicken has, when you add things up. So if you think about what am I doing here, I'm just giving you these names, and there's no way of hopefully I've named them in a way that we can infer what they are doing. So I'm just kind of defining what they do before we go through the implementation. In a real application, what would we do? How would this work? There would be documentation. The person who wrote this code, or somebody who is almost maybe even smarter than him, would say, okay, you might not need to know the code for update display, but this is what update display does, right? Sort of pseudocode, or there's different ways to document functions. Pseudocode is one way. There's even more specific ways of saying what to expect for arguments, what to expect for return values, all that stuff. So, but at this point, I'm kind of giving you the documentation for these functions verbally. Does that make sense? So that's what update display does. Handle number does that. If somebody presses a number button, handle number, we're going to program to have the intelligence to say what to do. If somebody presses a number, so there's going to be some logic in there that figures out, first of all, is it the appropriate time for a number? I guess in a calculator, it's always appropriate for a number, right? And 2, what does that number represent? Is it another digit in a number that's already being created? Or is it a new operand in itself? Right? So there's got to be you can already kind of say, handle number has to have a little bit of intelligence, right? And you're starting to see how, we're kind of putting this cabinet together, and as we see the pieces, you can start. Right, so handle operator. Anyone want to figure out what that might do?
Response to
Right, exactly. One of the 4 arithmetic operators: plus, minus, add, subtract, multiply, divide, essentially. So, so again, it's probably going to be what kind of function? Since it's designed to handle input, it's going to be probably an event, right? It's probably going to be an event. When somebody clicks on an operator, so the way we handle, or the way we named it, sort of gives it away, right? It's an event handler, right? It handles things in the event somebody presses an operator key. This is also going to be an event handler. Is this an event handler? Not just because it's not named handle, but because, remember, when we looked at that update display, we said there are a number of functions that might call it. So it's really a helper function of other events, but it's not an event unto itself. A user can't update the display. They could just click a number or an operator or an equal sign or a clear sign. But each one of those might update the display. In fact, all of those probably update the display in some way or another, right? Compute answer. So would that be a, that's probably the guts of our program if you think about it. So it probably, what's the first thing it probably does? It'd probably be an event and probably hung off of the equals key, right? And the first thing it probably checks is what? Yeah, so it probably tests what? So let's do that if statement, right? I clicked an equal sign. What if statement would be the first thing you run? If operand, they're right up there, right? So if operand.
If operand 1, 2, 3 operator fails, then you do something.
Yeah, if all three of those are not null, then the equal sign has context. Otherwise, just sit there and, maybe it's smart and it would say on the display, enter another number or enter an operator or something, It's not part of our spec, so we're not going to do that. But you see what I'm saying? But you're exactly right. That's a very good thing. And if we go down, you're learning already how to move from. So here's our computer answer, and the first thing it does is exactly what you said. Okay, make sense? So, again, this is should be somewhat straightforward. The concept of functions, which we learned in Project 2, and the concept of events, which we started to learn in Project 3, and we'll learn a little bit more of in this project. And in this project, we're going to learn not only how events work in general, but the important lesson is how you can genericize events and still get some context on that event, that specific event. Does that make sense? How you can apply an event to a set of objects, and when that event fires, actually get the object. And there were at least 2 or 3 questions from people on how to do that, both on the forum and in office hours today. And that's why I said on the forum, we're going to get to that. So let's see, where are we in this code? So we've got all these variables. In fact, I don't think I actually copied this over. So as you can see, these are 2 different statements, but they're just variable declarations, and each statement declares multiple variables. For sort of order's sake, we divided them into those that refer to page elements and those that are sort of working storage. There's no reason to do that. You could do it in 1 var, you could do it in 2 vars, you could do it in 30 vars, maybe not 30, but whatever it is, 7 or 8. So I'm going to copy this next set here and put it in my page, in my program page. And let's save that. And now we're going to start working on our, so at this point, really all we need to do is, everything is a function. What do we need to do now? We need to create functions. Do we create functions? Yeah, we declare functions. And through the declaration of them, we essentially create them. Yeah. So, and that's what we're doing here. So this is what we call a function declaration. And a function declaration is essentially the heart of JavaScript, in the sense that it's where you implement behavior, right? all this stuff we've done up until now has not really done any behavior, right? We've got elements on a page, we've got variables that know about those elements, but it's not until we get to our functions, it's functions that do things, right? If you think about a language, English, you have nouns and verbs. In a programming language, nouns are kind of the variables or objects, and functions are kind of the verbs. And as you know from language, if you don't have verbs, you can't really do anything. You could say Johnny, but you can't say run, Johnny, run. There is no language without verbs. So our functions is where we put the behavior into our programs. So I'm just going to copy this, and this should be pretty straightforward. This is a function that we're defining and naming update display. And it is, what is it doing? It is taking the value of this variable that we defined here, which at this point is 0, and applying it or assigning it to the inner HTML property of this object, display, which is our display element on the page, which is essentially that big gray box right here. This is display. This is display, and its contents is display. And this is the value of what? Display, what do we call it? Display text. Right? Display text is what's being displayed here. And is there any questions about any of this? Any questions about how we've defined these variables? JS Flint isn't going to like that. I'm going to go back there. Nobody has any questions about these variables. Some of you have programming experience. And when you define a variable in C++, you give it a data type. And we know in JavaScript that is just not as important. In fact, there is no way to, you could assign it a new object, like an array, but there's no way to say, yeah, this is a new string. I guess you could call it a new string and pass it. You could say var x equal new string and pass it the string value in the argument. But what is weird about the way we've assigned these variables and therefore type them? Because in most cases in JavaScript, we type by assignment, right? There's loose typing, and we do it real time. So what's weird about this? Really good, Justin. It's great. So this is a calculator. It's working with numbers. All of these variables have been assigned strings, right? At this point, we're just starting them as strings, but shouldn't you ask, isn't that weird?
Isn't the last two assigned?
These two are, correct. Yeah, but the things that really represent numbers, yeah, I mean, this operator is not really a number. But these three things represent numbers. This is always going to be the result, right? So for design purposes,
Easier to work with the text.
it's, well, why is it easier to work with it? So this is a design principle, right? This is like in the IKEA example. Why do you glue the drawer together before you put it in the cabinet, right? Because you can't do it afterwards, right? So why are we referring to something that we know is a number, and we know we're going to operate on as a number? We know we're going to want to do addition and subtraction. Why are we referring to them initially as strings?
Because we can go through the array of the string to validate each character.
We could, and why would we want to do that?
Well, you can test it for being null.
You could test a number for being null.
I need a gap name.
You can, well, not only that. So the answer was because you can concatenate, and I would say that's part of the correct answer. The answer truly is because before, in most cases, you run an operation in this calculator, you're going to concatenate. Because you need to allow for a multi-digit number. You see what I'm saying? So in almost all cases, you need to allow for the possibility of concatenation before operation. If it was neutral, if you aren't sure whether you're going to concatenate first and then operate second, which could be the case for some applications, then you might say, you know what, I'm not sure how to store this with the birth. But we know in this calculator example, there's probably the process will work that you're going to concatenate digits into a number, operate, and then operate on them from there. And so you're exactly right. That's why we did it this way. If you treat them as numbers, you have to put it back into a string, concatenate it. Yeah. Yeah, you could do some crazy thing, right? Yeah. So ultimately, what we only want a string until we have a number, an operand, to put it more specifically. Once we have an operand, we're ready to operate, we're then going to do magic to make them no longer a string. We're going to convert them, and programmers call data type conversions casting. So that's why I say it's kind of like magic. You know, we cast a magic spell, and we turn a string into a number, right? Because it's easier to concatenate on a string, exactly. And we know we're going to concatenate first. Okay. So we got that code in there. This should be pretty straightforward. Any questions about what we're doing here? This is what's known in JavaScript programming as pure wiring. You know, it's one of those functions that just wires things together. Take JavaScript and put it on the page, you know, or take something on the page and wire it to some JavaScript function. Events are a type of, you know, I'm using this facetiously, the word wiring, but a lot of what JavaScript programmers do is what they do. They wire a behavior to page and a page elements, right? So what we're doing here is wiring a behavior, the result, or the interim result, or maybe not even result, but the interim display to the element on the page that can make that display show up.
And can anybody contrast that process to anything like iOS or, you know, a regular Windows app or a Mac app? It's pretty much the same idea. You got to wire those things up.
You wire them up, and you typically do that right. And we're doing it very much the same way. There you'll get an object of your interface. You'll create an object of what your interface is and wire it up the same way. Here we kind of have it built in to some degree. Built in to the degree that we build it into our HTML structure. You know, that's how we define our DOM. Does that make sense? And that's your interface. So it's kind of like building an iOS app in a way, but you don't have to kind of start from scratch with an interface. Most, you know, like Objective-C comes with libraries that have the intelligence to display, you know, common page elements on a, you know, on an app. So, I mean, that's essentially what the DOM is, right? Does that make sense? So yeah, it is wiring. And in any, you know, in any of these type of programs where, you know, it's a user interactive program, like I said before, object-oriented programming allows you to think about things a little bit more abstractly and reuse code optimally, but in most of these cases you're really talking about functional modeling and kind of wiring things up. You know, so that's why I say, like, instead of kind of thinking about it as an object, let's kind of think about it as what are the pieces and then how do we put them together. At least that's the way I kind of went about thinking about this project. So we got the pieces, we know what we want to do, and we started to wire them together. This first wiring of it, this first behavior is very simple, right? Now, take something that a function is going to give us and put it in the display. And there's probably going to be multiple functions that call on this helper function, like I said before. So let's look at the next function, definition.
So the function is
The function is named update display. And we invoke it like this in JavaScript using the expression method of defining a function. We can syntactically declare it like that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And, okay. Okay, step number 8. Okay, so here we're defining our next function. And this function is the reset function. And again, the behavior, if you look at any one of these, why do we do functional programming like this? Why do we break things up into functional units? So we can reuse them, and so each functional unit is theoretically simple enough that it makes sense. You know, you're not doing too much at once. All we're doing here is, if somebody wants it clearer, you know, let's think of the logic. What do we need to do? Well, if they're clearing the equation, we want to get rid of any residuals or any artifacts that might be in that equation. So get it back to where it started. In a sense, this is just like reloading the page. And essentially, if you look at this, it's exactly what we do when we reload the page. We're redefining these variables back to where they started. So we do that, and then we call out our helper function. If there's anything in display, update it with this new display text, which is now 0, right? Back where it started. Right? However, there's one thing new here, right? Not only is this a function with a function declaration, but as we said before, this function is a special type of function. It's an event handler, right? So we not only have to define the function, we also have to wire it or bind it to what we want it to be invoked by the user. What an event is a way of binding a page element to allow a user to invoke it, instead of you invoking it, programmatically. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So we're saying when, yeah, here we're calling a method called addEventListener, which is part of the document object and all of its children. And we're calling it from it's part of the prototype of document, obviously, right? And we're calling it on a specific element, this clear button, which is this C right here, right? And you can see what it just did, right? And so when somebody clicks on that, when somebody clicks on that, so what event specifically are we listening for? This is JavaScript, or to be more precisely, this is a constant in the event object of the JavaScript document object. Does that make sense? And that might, I'm not sure that all hangs together, but you see what I'm saying? I think event is probably part of the DOM somehow, and this is a constant, which means I know about this event. It's a variable. It's a string that is predefined, right? And what is this?
Reset.
It is reset. It is the function. It is declaring as the second argument of the addEventListener method. It's saying, what function do you want to run as the event handler to this event listener that you're applying? Very good. And then the false is a Boolean indicating how the event should be reacted to. Most of the time you set this to false. So I'm not going to get into that. You can look at addEventListener up in the DOM documentation. And I think it has to do with bubbling. I'm not 100% sure, but don't quote me on that. So does this make sense? We are defining our second function. All it does is put the behavior behind that C button. And what we're doing in these two statements, JavaScript statements, are 1, declaring a function, and 2, declaring an event listener that takes that function as its second argument, which makes it the event handler.
How do you tie those two?
Just like this. This equals this.
So how do you tie it to that?
This equals, where's the C button?
Right here.
Here. Right, that ties to this, right? Ties to refer to it in JavaScript like this, add a listener to it. when somebody does this behavior on that, by proxy, invoke this method. Is really what an event handler is. Now I don't think it's a good way of referring to it as a proxy, but it's what's the word in physics? Cause and effect, right? Stimulus and response, according to what was that guy's name? Skinner, right? Skinner. Yeah, well, Pavlov did it, but Skinner defined what they were. Stimulus and response. When I went to college, we had rats, not web pages, that we trained. we programmed. Function, press this, return a pellet. You know? That was more fun, actually. So, okay, so I'm going to paste, we're up here, step 8, I'm going to paste this in. And remember, all this is, we're still in the IKEA thing, you know, but we're going a little deeper into how we designed it, hopefully. Hopefully this will be true, that you're starting to see some of that. And after I do this, we are going to take a break, just to let you know. So, any questions at home? So none of this will work. Well, some of it will work, but not all of it will work until we get all the behaviors in, obviously. And ultimately, we will do what we did with the slideshow. The last step, we'll kind of wrap it into one of those anonymous self-invoking functions, right? Do you remember that? There were a couple of questions about that on the forum, a couple of good questions, right? So, and it is a weird syntax, and to some degree I said it's a leap of faith, you know, do it. But, you know, I did put some pointers up there. If you do want to drill down into it, there's more sophisticated ways of using that pattern. There's a link, and I'll show you where that is. I think it might be at the bottom of this one. So if you're interested more in that, maybe it was in, I'll find it. I'll show it to you. Maybe it was in objects. It was in constructor function. Oh no, it was in objects. Yes. Yeah, so no. Oh, well, I'll find that link. It was a sort of an explanation of that anonymous function self-invoking wrapper that we used in the slideshow, is what I'm referring to. So I'll find that over the break, and I'll show you that link. The reason I'm pointing it out is some of you might not, do you get those? You don't get emails with, even if you've asked a question, do you get emails when I reply to these forums? Does anybody in this class ask a question? You've used it. Okay. So you might, you know, one thing you might want to do is subscribe to these forums, because there's good questions on it. And it's,
so far, the questions I've asked.
you can't subscribe to the whole forum?
Not that I've seen, but it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, that's too bad, because it would be, well, I put no one as a moderator. So I get them all. I'm a moderator. And I don't think I want to make you all, I don't know if we want to do that. You'd have to answer questions. So, but anyway, it is, regardless, I know it's not an ideal commenting system, but it's a good idea to look on here from time to time with the pages, because your questions you might have might already be answered on here. Even better, questions you might not even have had in your imagination might be on here, and you could be even more confused. So we're going to get a 10-minute break here. Any questions before we break at home or in our studio audience? Okay, we'll be back at, let's make it a quarter after.
Portable stuff is all realistic.
Okay, so did that lady say we're back?
I don't remember hearing it.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me at home? Turn on those speakers.
Oh wait, no power. There we go. Now we're good. Is it recording?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think it is recording.
Oh, now we
Yeah, you're recording.
Cool. All right. Turn it down so we don't get feedback. But thanks. Okay, so let's see. Where were we? We're about halfway through step 8. Before we get back into project 4, let's see. I haven't looked at project 3s yet. Project 2, I wanted to show you this one. This is one of the, I thought this was a pretty cool example. So this one extended it in a couple of ways. This is Steve K. So from our, if you want to follow along with this from our projects, and Steve, if you're online, I'm sorry to point it out if you're, but posting something here makes it in the public domain. So anyway, to get to this project, just go to Steve's site. There we go, project 2. And what I like about this is a couple of things. One, he expanded it in terms of the date object to include minutes. So a few other people did that, but it just kind of goes an extra step to explore that date thing, which we really used as more of an integer when we're just looking at the seconds. But in this example, and you could look at the code, we won't go through it line by line, but if you look at the code, you'll see that he has the logic to actually manipulate both the seconds and the minutes of the date object, right? So he's using that as part, he's created a new spec. The other thing that's kind of cool is he's really done a nice job with the visual design of this thing. And he's fixed a lot of the pause things that weren't, some of the things we all worked on and fixed. So anyway, I thought there were a lot of great examples. This isn't the only good example, and might not. I didn't point it out to be the best, but it is, if you're interested in looking at somebody who did, a couple of extra things that were kind of cool. Steve's was good. I'm sorry?
Did you find grade?
I graded all of project 2 that was there as of the beginning of this week. If you didn't get a grade, let me know. I haven't started on 3 yet. We start that. Yeah. So I know, like I said, there are a lot of good examples, and it's a good idea to go through and see what other students are doing. Maybe not do copy and paste all the time, but it's a good idea to see. We can learn from each other. All right. So let's get back into project 4, the calculator. So 99 minus 11. It's pretty cool that we could, program something like this in, half hour, 45 minutes, under 100 lines of code. I mean, think about that first calculator. HP12C was a couple $100 or whatever, when I went to school. Okay, so still going to school. We never stop. So here's where things get interesting. So as I said, we're kind of looking at in project 2, we were very functionally oriented. In project 3, and even more so now, we're looking at functions not only as just functions, but as event handlers as well. The reset was an event handler that was kind of pretty specific. In other words, it knew what was pressed, and it knew everything that it needed to affect. What it needed to affect wasn't context sensitive to what was affected. Does that make sense? So, let's get back to the Skinner stimulus and response example. If you hit a rat for doing the wrong thing, it should learn, right? But you got to hit the right rat, So what we're going to learn now is how do you write the hit function so it hits the right rat. If you press the 3, how does it know what you pressed? So where this is a more specific event handler, when we move into the handle number, we're going to move into a more, like I said, generic or generally programmed event handler. I am, thank you. Very good. Thanks. You get extra credit for it. So you click a number. So here we get back into, okay, I know I need a draw. Now's the time I just got to do the draw. So how will we design this? What are the pieces? What are the pieces of behavior? And then once we take a very specific piece of behavior, it's really a matter of just going through the steps. What are we really doing? Somebody presses a number. What behavior do we want? Well, first of all, what is a number? It really is one of those 10 buttons that have the text of a 0 through 9 on them, right? When we say click a number, we really mean clicking on one of these plus this buttons, right? All of which have a number class and a BTN class. So we know who they are because we've got them in our, what? In our collection, right? We've got them right here. We could refer them in general by this name, right? So we can apply a common behavior to all of them by applying that event listener to that name, right? So to work a little bit backwards, before we even look into the implementation of the function itself, how do we apply the event listener? We iterate through the elements that we want to apply that listener for and apply to each of them individually that event listener. Make sense? We know what the collection is, right? We even know its length because it's an array. We could get at its length, right? We can assign that to that variable we assigned way back in one of the working storage. Remember that? This was varred or defined way back up in working storage. Remember that? And essentially what we're saying in pseudocode is for each button that we've classed as a number, put an event listener on it, make it a click event listener, and this one function is going to be the event handler for all of those elements, right? And as we iterate those, basically change the index on the collector variable that holds that collection. Remember I said before, even though Mozilla called it in its documentation a node list, in JavaScript it's so, what's the word, amorphous that we could refer to objects using array notation like we are here. Right?
So that array notation tells you which button it was clicked on.
Correct. So, yeah, so do we know which 0 is? We might not. We don't, first of all, we don't care because they all have the same handler. But they're probably going to be assigned in this order that they will load it onto the page. It's not a guarantee.
No.
Might not be a guarantee. Might be how you go about, might be how the page, there might be, yeah, I don't think it would be a guarantee.
If you could see that in the control panel.
In the control panel.
In Google Chrome.
Yeah, but, so you could debug it and try to find a value at any point in time in your program, but there's no guarantee that all you're doing is saying, I'm putting this same handler on all of these elements that match that selector. Make sense?
Because it could be a 3 one time the first one's scrapped, and it could be a 9 the first time on a different number.
The same handler is going to deal with it either way. So given that, you press a button, and at this point we don't really care what button is pressed, right? What do we care about? What is the logic of pressing a button? We started mentioning it before. Well, of course, then it was pressed.
Define the value.
Right.
So they've got to capture the value
Right.
in context of what's pressed next.
In context of, well, do you know the context of what's pressed next?
Not yet.
So it's really in the context of what was pressed before, and what are you looking for? What is the differentiator?
Multiple numbers.
And what is the way of getting multiple numbers? How do you know you've gotten multiple numbers? Yeah, in a way. So the real divider is, are you following an operator or not? Does an operator exist? If an operator exists, you're working on the second number. If an operator doesn't exist and you type a number in, you're working on the first number. So the first logic is there an operator? If operator is no, then everything you type in is going to be annexed, appended. This is the appending. This is the concatenate appender, right? Make it equal to what it is. Correct. It is the addition operator, unless we define these as strings. I remember we did. Right? Remember I pointed that out and said, here's why we define these as strings. Because it's driving you crazy, because we're talking about a number, we're clicking a number, we're working in a calculator, and we're concatenating it as a string. But we explained that, right? Because first you need a string of numbers before you can calculate. Because a number is a string of digits. And when we're calling these things numbers, they're really digits. Right? Sometimes it's good to name your variables a little bit more specifically. Even though they are numbers, a key is really a digit in this case. And we might have used that, digit costs to be a finger, I guess. But you know what I'm saying? It's a little bit more specific. It might give context to the next program that has to figure this out.
You call an STR digit.
Yeah, you could do that.
It's not working as a function of if I press 5 and then I press 8, adding them together, it's putting them next to each other.
It's concatenating them as a string. It's making, so 5 plus 8 in this case is not 13, it's 58.
Right.
Which is the behavior that we want.
This is a 5 over and
Right.
58 next.
Exactly right. So that's all we're doing. And so all we need to do is a very simple thing, right? For you guys in CSS land, all we need to do is what? Text the line right to display, and it looks like a number, right? Yeah, you concatenate another thing, and everything shifts over here, right? So the beauty, the zen and the art of beauty of web design is exactly this. Sometimes CSS can give you behavior, and when it can, use it, because it's a lot easier than programming JavaScript. You know what I mean? And a lot more accessible to the people that might need to work on this after you're on a better project, right? So if you can do it in CSS, do it. Kind of like we learned in that slideshow. If CSS can do the fade, let it do it. Browsers can probably run it faster than the JavaScript you're going to write to them, right? So the point we're learning here is we've got a generic event handler. We're going to look into the guts of that now. And we're applying it to multiple objects. And it's got to be smart enough to do what it needs to do for all of those objects, and smart enough to do what it needs to do for every object, right? So how does it know when you press that element that you want it to represent the digit 3? How do you do that? Where's the magic in that? It's right here. Right? So, what does this statement say? First of all, let's take a step back. A couple of questions. I think, Joan, you might have had one, or there are a few on the forum in the last day or two, about how do you get the context of an event if that event is part of an object? How do you find out what called it from that object? And the way events work is, whether you know it or not, when an event handler fires, it automatically gets an event object as its argument.
When the event fires.
When the event fires.
Not the event handler. The event handler.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. When the event fires, it passes the event handler its event object. Correct. Yeah. Event listeners and event handlers are terminology that is really difficult to use because they're different contexts. So I'm going to try to avoid that, but that is a good distinction. The event is an object that's created by whatever it was that created that event, a timer event, a user event, or whatever. And the event handler is the function that we've programmed to, or a function, there might be multiple event handlers, that we've programmed to be implicitly invoked should that event happen, right? And also implicitly, the event object is passed as an argument to that event handler. And that event object has meaningful information packed into it, such as what actually was the thing that was clicked or that the event operated on, right? And that property is called target, right? So the event target is, in this case, what was clicked on that caused this event handler to be invoked. And that event target is nothing more than what? No, the event is a click. The event is a type click. It's the button itself. Yeah, it's what you expect almost this to be, and some of you tried to use this for some of that, but that didn't work, right? So in some cases it might, in some cases it might not. In this way, we're assured that we're actually getting what we want, what was clicked, the target of the event itself.
So this is somewhat analogous to objects that are prototypes of other objects. You kind of have a connection back to your prototype. It's kind of under the hood connection. So whenever you actually say, hey, I'm about to create an event listener, you know, now I got some kind of connection to any of my handlers. That's true or not?
I'm not sure I understand that. So
the question is, how does a handler / listener know when an event actually is fired? How does that event have some knowledge of what the listeners or handlers are?
Yeah, so the window object has, I'm sure, so that's a good question. The internals probably of a window object have some kind of event broker that wires it all up using the DOM. It is my guess. Now, events are a little bit more even complex than that because you can have multiple event handlers for any event. In fact, an event might have multiple targets, right? So let's go to this example. I'm not sure you've seen this. We did talk about this at one point. So here we have 3 elements on a page. Each of them has an event handler on them for click, right? If I click on this element, I'm actually firing 3 events. I'm not just clicking on the paragraph. I'm clicking on the section that also has an event listener of which the paragraph is a member. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm also clicking on body for that matter, right? I don't happen to have an event listener on body, but I do have event listeners on the div, the section, the paragraph, the section, and the div. And if you look here, this is event.target, and this is event.current target. So and this code is all in, is tied to this element. Is an event handler that's assigned to this element. Does that make sense? So, and I could show you the code. Yeah, it's probably better to use source. And maybe here. Nope. Where is my code? Is it in? Oh, here it is. So, excuse me. So, this is everything that's clickable, right? Clickable class. The div is clickable. The paragraph is clickable, and the section is clickable. Do you see that? Yeah. So they all are are in this collection. Then we get these are just the events. So this is where we're going to put the output. It's just let's put it. That's where those things are displayed when we click. Here we're putting the on-click event listener on each of those 3 elements. Anything that's clickable, right? The div, the P, and the section. And then the event handler is display on the page. So this event handler is on each of these, right? When I do one click, that's one event, but there's 3 listeners listening for it. The first listener is on P, so it's going to say is on that P, and it's going to say the target for this is P, and the current target is P, right? But for the second one, so essentially what this is known as is bubbling. This is called event bubbling, and what happens is when you click on something of which there are multiple event handlers, it'll propagate down the page, or actually propagates up the page, and runs the event handlers in that order, and then bubbles down the page. So and this is probably beyond the scope of this class. In fact, if you get event target, it's good, because that's all we're using in Project 4. But you should know that events can be more complex, and you can have multiple events handled by one actual event.
What's the difference between event current target and event target? One goes blue, and the other one prints out. So current target can be multiple things, but you only have one.
So I have one event, which was a click.
Perfect.
Right? What I'm saying is the paragraph for all of those events was the target, because I actually clicked on that within the context of the whole thing, but all of them were named as a current target when that event was pressed.
Current target being more general than target.
Current target being more specific.
But only the one you click on goes blue, all the other, all of the events print.
So
all the handlers print with that event talked about. But only one thing was blue.
Yeah. So what I mean by more specific is so think about it. Each of those event handlers has to say what was clicked. It's going to say specifically what was clicked most generically. But for my event handler, in the context of what I'm trying to run, what is the specific target? And that's what I mean by current target is more specific. Does that make sense? So
You have 3 targets on that page. The current target is the one you click.
you have 3 elements on that page.
Yeah.
They each have an event on them. We click once, all of those events, all of those event handlers are invoked, right? As they're invoked, each of those event handlers knows not only what is the target that invoked me, but they also know, I guess more generically, what was the most specific target that was clicked. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, because what's really happening is that whenever you click, it goes blue, and everybody who's listening around will print out to the page. That's essentially the behavior, right? If you click on the section, it goes blue. If you click on the div, it goes blue.
Yeah, if I click on here, that goes blue.
But how many
Right.
printouts do you get? That's 2 or 3.
I get 2. Yeah, because I didn't click on P, right? Right? Click on here. So this is both my current. If I click on here, let me do it this way. If I click on here, the current target for div is in a different event handler. It's really the same event handler, but it's a different instance of that event handler. It's a different invocation of that event handler. Does that make sense? It's the third invocation. It's the one that is furthest down in the bubbling, right? If I click on this, these aren't affected, and this now becomes both my target and my current target. All right? So, like I said, this is a little bit more
Well, that's
than you.
very helpful to understand understand.
But this is very good.
How events fire.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because you have
Yeah.
to capture those.
Yeah. So they fire by creating an object, and that object is automatically the argument that's passed to the event handler, and they fire in that object is packed a bunch of information. Probably the most useful information is the target, and in most cases that'll tell you specifically, most specifically, what object and what event handler was clicked in this case, right? And once you have access to that, sorry, I'm losing my voice. Once you have access to that, you could do whatever you want to it because it's a DOM object. You could change its style. You can add another event listener to it. You can, you can do anything. You know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, using different events and,
I don't. I have one event handler. I set up 3 listeners, really, that all for a generic event handler. Kind of similar to what we're doing in this project.
That's really helpful. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a little bit of a diversion, and for many of you, if it goes a little bit over your head, don't worry about it. What you do need to know for Project 4 is the target property of the event object for the 2 generic event handlers we're going to create. So one of those is the number handler, right, which is where we are now. And where are we? And now that we have the target, we could get what? It's text content, right? So what is text content? Well, it's obviously a property. If we do, it's a property of the DOM, right? And it not only works like inner HTML on an element that might have an inner node of text, like a paragraph, but it's generic enough that it also works on something like a button that might have text in its inner node as well. Okay. I think I know that guy. I don't know where I know that guy. That's pretty scary. So let's go a little deeper into this. So we know not only what was clicked, but we know the actual value that's in the button, and from there it becomes easy. If there is no operator being stored in our working storage, then you're working on operand 1, and concatenate whatever number was there. If it's a first number, put it in there. If it's a second digit of that number, put it in there. If you know what I mean, keep going, and then change the display text to be operand 1 in that case, right? Whatever you come up with from here, right? So if there's the 0 and you press a 3, put the 3 in there. If you press another 3, you're just going to concatenate that to the end, and then update this again. Now, updating the text display, does that update the web page?
No.
What updates the web page?
Okay.
Exactly. This updates the value that you want update display to use. You don't need to pass it as an argument because it's implemented right here and it can find it. It's just a variable that it's going to grab it right out of the variable, right? Because it's all part of the same. We're going to wrap that all in one of those anonymous functions, obviously.
Can I ask a question about that statement about there? What does that mean?
That E, that's a very good question. Who wants to answer that? Yeah. So be more specific. It's the event object. So very good. So I said something before. I said every event implicitly creates an event object that is passed as the argument to the event handler. If you don't put that E in there, the event handler doesn't accept that event object. If you put the E in there, you're saying expect an object, something to be passed to you, and it's going to be an event. We know that. The convention is to refer to it as E or event, Like E is better.
Is there any convention that a listener is different than the handler? And that's why they use two different words, or?
That's a good. So, like I said before, they're weird. It's a weird terminology. So,
Is that E related to Windows? Is it passes that event around?
it's just it's a variable name that we don't put a var in front of because. Yeah, but it could be anything. We could call it event. We could call it my event. We could call it whatever.
Do you ever have one new on unit jobs?
Ah, good question. So what is the scope of that E?
Yeah, I guess that's
So the scope of an argument is the function in which it's being passed. You can use it safely because its scope is defined to the if you think of an argument as the window through which a hot dog can be passed, and In-N-Out burger, whatever, so we're passing it an event object. If you don't put that in there, it's still available, but the function isn't accepting it. It could be, no. I mean, look at this. Here's an event listener. There's still an event when this fires. When somebody clicks on the clear button, an event object is created, and it's available to reset. I am not using it in my definition of reset, so therefore I can't refer to its target or any part of it. But I don't need to accept it. Does that make sense? Unlike C, where your arguments in the declaration have to match the arguments that you pass, JavaScript gives you the event. If you don't want it, ignore it. But if you want it, refer to it, and if you want to refer to it in a way that other JavaScripties will kind of recognize your code, call it E. Because some programmers, some shops say put the E in there. Don't cause trouble. Put the E in every one. Even if you null it out or whatever. It's a convention. Let me put it this way. Crawford gives us an okay for this code. Without the E, yeah.
I don't know if you want to answer that question, but for scope inside that, if you refer to this, it's referring to the clicked on object. What if you wanted to reference your class? There's no way to put bar that this because this is already an event.
Yeah, so that's why you want to use this event object.
How would you get around that though if you wanted to call your class? Now say you wanted to call a method, this was in a class, you wanted to call a method in the class. You could not use this, you could not name that this.
So there are our classes.
Well, you know what I mean? It's like the last assignment. If this was in the last assignment, you were going to call a method inside, a prototype method inside of it, and you want to call this dot your method, it
Right.
wouldn't work because this would refer to the clicked on element.
Not the, well, what do you want it to refer to?
The whole class of so-called class, a method in that class.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So yeah, so you wouldn't program that in an event handler. You might have an event handler that then calls a function that can.
That's what I did.
Yeah.
It gets complicated. I was just wondering if there was an easier way to go.
Well, yeah, that's hard. It's very complicated.
You can't use that. You can't name that this because this is already the clicked object.
Right.
Which is why, at that point, honestly, from a JavaScript standpoint, from what I understand,
Yeah.
don't do object-oriented stuff at that point. Think about them as functions.
But I wanted to be encapsulated so you could use this class, and just plug it in somewhere because my thumbnails are generated.
So your thumbnail is a part of the slideshow,
Yes.
and when you click on there, you want the event to refer specifically.
I've got that part.
Okay.
But when you click on it, then you need to run the render method, and you can't call a render method.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I found a way around it, but it just feels clunky and wrong.
Yeah. Let me look. It's kind of a little different than this topic, but I think I get it. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, in this handler, you use the object, but in the other one you don't.
Correct.
What's the lifetime of that object? Like if it's something you use in your function, you don't put it in your argument is.
Yeah, I think
What happens to it is
it's.
how long does it last?
I don't think it has. Yeah, it's. That's a good question. I don't know, but I don't know what the life cycle of an event is. But I imagine if you don't accept it as an argument in that function, it doesn't have any life. It's only use as that, which is another issue unto itself. You know, many more sophisticated systems come up with the more sophisticated concept of an event broker, where events do have more of a life cycle and can be sort of subscribed to beyond this. But in this case, my guess is that's a good question. My guess is its life cycle is being passed to its event handler, and after that, it has no context. And I might be wrong, but no, that's feedback there. Peanut gallery. So, any of this make sense at this point, or any of this not make sense? We went over the if case. Obviously, else is if there is an operator, then pseudocode, we're working on the second number, and each digit represents another digit in the second number. Right? Does that make sense? Operand 2 is the second number, and then we have an operand at the end of this. You know what I mean? So update the display. It might not be our ultimate operand. In other words, the user could click another button with a digit on it. But that's fine. You know, at least we have, for this state, an operand. Right? So this will always result in an operand, pressing a number. It might be the first one, it might be the second one, it might be the first digit of either one, it might be another digit of either one, but it will always result in creating an operand. It might not be the ultimate operand that we operate on, but its output will be an operand that then is sent to the display. So, I don't know if I already copied this.
The operand will never show in the display?
The operand will show each time in the display. So here. So the number. So let's just refresh the page. And so the number handler. Click on a 4. We now have a new operand. We know we haven't clicked on operator yet. So therefore, this operand is operand 1. Right? If I click this again, it's still operand 1 because I still haven't clicked an operator, right? But it's the second digit of operator. Right? So now I click a operator, and you're right. So we haven't gotten to that function yet, the operator handler, but it did not change the display, right? Until I enter, which is not that intuitive. It should have put maybe the operator in there. You know? Yeah. So I think that's part of the assignment. So. So we have 42. We hit the plus sign. Now that we've got a value. What do we know? We haven't seen that function yet, but we can assume by clicking the plus sign that we now have a value in that operator variable, right? And if you don't believe me, we could go. What did we call it? We called it operator? Operator.
I keep getting that same thing on mine. I've been trying to get different values out of mine.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. Maybe operator is not a good thing to put in there. How about if we type in operator?
On other variables. Somebody gave you ideas.
Yeah, probably now they're teaching me how to use it. It's probably wrapped in the closure. Thank you. So unfortunately, the way it's ultimately implemented in the anonymous function closure pattern is preventing us from using the console, which is looking at global variables, right? So you don't want to wrap things until you debug them. Does everyone understand that lesson? Once you wrap things in that anonymous function, so can you say?
What if you name the function?
So if I go, maybe I did. So if I go, yeah, if you name it,
the annualized.
You got that? Yeah, you're right. But we didn't do that in this case. It's anonymous. Right?
So that's what,
And in that thing that I promised you I would show you where that link is, which I didn't do. Maybe I'll have to, but somewhere, this website for our class works pretty good in general, but there's so many pages sometimes I forget where I put things. And if I put a link in the comments, they're not easy to find. So here, let's do this.
is that why you're not able to get through that slide thing when it kicks off? The whole function is running all the time.
Cycle?
Yeah,
You could call cycle.
but I can't get through it to see what it starts displaying at the end of it, but I don't know, can't get through it.
Oh, you can't see the,
But it's a global function.
yeah. So so what am I talking about here? So this is called JavaScript, anonymous function, module pattern, let's say. Yeah, this is it. No, Stack Overflow. This is the article I linked to. And this is actually a pretty good article. It talks about the basic adequately good programming. So anonymous closures in general, and then it goes on to say how to build them so that they can be referred to by a specific name, and different ways of doing that. This is linked somewhere from our site. I will link it in a better place than the comments so that it's easier to see. Does that make sense? Again, probably beyond the scope for most of you, but many people are curious about it, so that might be helpful. So where are we? Project 4. So we are at the point where the fun starts happening, right? We could create an operator with the handle number function. We could create, an operand. We could create an operand 1, operand 2, depending on whether an operator is there. We could display that to the screen. The next thing we have to do is create the handler should somebody type in an operator, right? So, again, there are 4 operators: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And our goal here is to create a function that's generic enough to handle any of those. So again, applying the event listener is a matter of iterating through the collection of elements that you want to apply the event listener to, right? Should be pretty straightforward, right? We have this collection, right? We got it. I think we did this exactly for the last example. This is the code, the structure. In the structure we have, it's going to collect anything with a class of operator. So this button with the plus, this button with the minus, this button with the multiply, and this button with the divide or slash, right? And it puts it into this and then our JavaScript puts it into this, a collection with the variable name of this, right? Just by calling this method on the DOM, right? So we now have this collection that has all these, and then when we get down to needing to add behavior to them, we can just apply, by iterating through that collection, the same event listener for the click event for each of those. The same event listener, the event listener in this case, the event handler in this case, I'm sorry, being handle operator. Right?
String of digits will eventually become a number. The string of the operator.
So, yeah, so that's a good question. So the string of the operator. So somebody clicks on a button that we happen to have classed as an operator. The handler, again, takes the handoff of that event object, gets its target, gets its value, and if there is no operator, it assigns that string to operator. If there is, then it ignores it. Right? If there's already an operator, it just says you can type plus as much as you want. I'm going to ignore it. Right? This also means that you can only deal with 2 operands, which is good for up to like maybe first grade. And one of the things you want to do in this project is to make it a 3rd grade compatible calculator. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is equal to that. Right? But at this point you could see in the logic where it can only deal with 1 operator. Right?
Actually, you can't do that with your calculator. 1 plus 2 plus 3.
Yeah, you can.
You can't do it now, but you should be able to. Yeah.
One of the regular calculators, you add and other operators. You do a plus and divide.
Yeah, but you couldn't ever do it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it depends on whether it's a Polish notation or not. Seriously, there's what we can do.
We use RPM?
That's all. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, you could if you want. That's Polish. Is what reverse Polish, right? That's where you type the number, the operand, and then the operator, or operator and then 2 operators. Right. Yeah. It's been a while. HP12C. Which is the you know why they do it that way? It's for bond traders essentially. Well, probably engineers first actually, but so you could program the functions essentially. So if there's an operator, then ignore this. You know, if operator is it. So if there is no operator, do this. If there is an operator, ignore this. Essentially, is what it's saying. It doesn't say that. It says if there is no operator, do this. But in logic, the converse is going to be true, right? So you're going to ignore this.
You could easily change that to say, replace the operator with pass.
What you want to do is ignore it. What you want to do is ignore it only if the last keystroke was an operator. You know what I'm saying? Because if you don't want to do 1 plus 2 plus 3, you don't want it 1 plus 2 plus. But you know what I mean? So you want to you'd have a different if statement here. But I'll leave that up to you. Does that make sense?
Right, you're saying if the operator is blank, then give me the operator.
Here I'm essentially saying this calculator can only deal with 1 operator at a time. What I'm saying is if you were going to program it to deal with multiple operands and multiple operations, more than 2 operands and more than 1 operation, then your logic here would change to say, let's just make sure that this is a new operand following an operator. Following you know what I mean. Following an operand, a number. Yeah. All right. So, but that's the logic behind it. Yeah, which are variables.
Right. I think we could just use the operator 1 as
We're doing the same exact thing. We have variables.
new operations.
In an HP12C, you have access to registers, which are nothing more than variables that you really can't give a name to. They're pre-named. Here, we're naming these numbers, and we only have 2 buckets for them right now. You might have operand 4 or 5 or X. In fact, operand should be an array that you could keep popping to. So that's up to you to figure out, right? Well, so let's see how we implement this before we move on to much more. So we got handle number, we got handle operator. So what ultimately happens? So you click one of these and you have an operator. What does it do? It just assigns that operator. It doesn't change the display. It doesn't compute the answer. Because an operator, because we're not using RPM, you can't figure it out from just the operator. You know, you have to hit the equal sign because you need that second number, that second operand. So compute answer, therefore, is going to be an event handler on the equal button. Right? So there's no implicit compute answer like many calculators. Although you could, because it's a separate function, you could just call it differently, right? If you want to implement a a 3 or more operand environment, you could still use this function. You have to call it differently. Is the point I'm making, right? So,
Make it a real concept.
so this is, yeah, if you want to make it a real, yeah, in fact, that is the assignment. To behave more like a traditional calculator. And that's actually the first extra credit part of it. More like, which allows multiple inputs, right? So, calculate the answer. Compute answer is a new function. It is an event handler on the, it's called the enter button, but it's really the equal button, right, in this case. You could hang this off of a key, right, the enter key. We can handle, we're using click events here, but you could use keyboard events. In fact, one of the assignments, extra credit for, you know, maybe the top 1% of you guys out there, no joking, is to allow for, you know, it makes a lot of sense to have keyboard input into a calculator, right? Or, yeah, a time calculator would be, yeah. That would be pretty cool, actually.
All your answers at midnight.
So, so what does compute answer do? As we say, we have a string that's a number. We have a second string that's a number at this point, and we have a string that is an operator. Does everyone understand that?
Yep.
And they're all part of this space. They're all available to us. They're variables that are defined at the global spot at wherever we are in this widget, right?
That's the magic, right?
So here's the magic, and there's not much magic to it. So first of all, do we have everything we need to come up with an answer? Right? Well, first of all, let's make sure that we don't have an answer going into this. No preconceived notions. So is this really required? It might be, you know, given the state, you know, you might have had somebody mess around with that calculator a little bit, put a 0 in there to make it look like your result is 0 by typing it in there, but there might be a result from a previous calculation and you might not know it. So in this case, it's just a good idea to be safe. It might have been 0 when we first started this thing, but we don't know when this compute answer is going to be invoked. So let's be safe about it. If its purpose in life is to give us an answer, let's make sure it starts with no preconceived notions. No prejudice is allowed in this class. So do we have everything we need? This is sort of the magic of casting, right? In JavaScript, we have this function we use quite a bit. Enough that you kind of are going to know this, like get element, you know, by ID.
Parse and then choose and log them just now.
Yeah, so it's just a way to get the number out of a string. And it'll take, I believe, the first set of contiguous numerals and turn that into a number. And if you invoke this function with a second argument, that argument will be the base system of the number that is returned. Does that make sense? So if you have a string that's 1/6, right, and you do 1/6, like my license plate, you know, 1/6 XYZ, right? So you do or 1/6 XYZ 45, right? So you do a parsent on that, I think you'll get 1/6 the number, right? If you do a parsent, comma, so the first argument is that string, the second argument is 10, you'll get 16. But if you do parsent, that string, and 8, what will you'll just get a 2. Right? Or is it 2? Yeah, or 1 actually. 2. 16, yeah, 20.
You
Yeah.
can do a hexadecimal, you get half.
2 8 is 2. Right? 20. Right. Sorry. a hard time thinking in bases. So, but does that make sense? Parsing is just going to strip out the first. In this case, we're using it to get at the first string that represents a number. In this case, we're really using it as casting because there'll never be anything other than a numeral in there, because that whole thing was constructed by an event handler that only could deal with buttons that have numbers on them. We know that, but at least in this case, we're using parsing to cast that string to a number. So we cast both of the operands, right? Because we know we have both of them at that point. And then we don't really want to, the operator we're not going to cast. There's no operator type, right? There's no operator data type. Each one has its own behavior. The good news is that behavior is pretty basic in JavaScript in the sense that that operator actually represents what it does, So there might even be a better way of programming this by taking that string and actually baking it into a formula, you know what I mean? But
Just keep out a formula.
yeah, you might be able to do something like that. In this case, it's probably best to go through the code and the logic in this case. So, what are we doing? This is what is a switch statement? It's a conditional. Yeah, branching or conditional, I think those are pretty synonymous. Should this be the case, do this. Should that be the case, do that. Break means do that and don't do anything else. You can't be both, or even if you are both, don't do both. Right? Like parse int. Just take the first set of numbers and ignore the rest. So that's a good question. It doesn't check for 0 on the divide, does it? Does it do that down here?
Well, one way you just get nothing, you get 0, and the other way you get infinite.
So 2 divided by 0 equals infinity. So that's correct, right? Did we put that in there? JavaScript's pretty smart, huh? Yeah. So what does that mean? So we learned this in week 1, right? Infinity is a value. JavaScript is actually in some ways smart. It has all these weird values that come in handy. Infinity is a value where, like at C, it's it would blow up or something. Other things are like not a number is a value. Right? So we learned some of these specialized values. Null is actually a value. You're right. So you want to, in this case, testing for a 0 divisor doesn't really help in this case, but as soon as you get more sophisticated, you're going to have to do that. You're correct. And you know how to do that. It's pretty simple. You just have to make sure you do it and do it at the right time.
So thinking about Excel for a second, when you write an Excel formula, and you essentially kind of type out your formula at the top, and then you get the entity, and that's what it computes out to you for your Excel.
That's correct.
So not exactly a calculator, but you use the same principle.
Yeah, Excel is a programming language. You're exactly right. So the question was, in Excel, how would you do this? The way
For this project, if you just captured whatever people were typing in through your keys and keep it so you can see it, and then when you're ready, hit equal and get your answer.
right. So
It would be just as relevant. Right?
so Excel has a concept of formulas and functions,
Correct.
and you would create a formula. In this case, we do have formulas, right? In fact, we have full formulas.
Correct.
And we apply those formulas based on the operand that was typed in, right? So in Excel, there is, this is an Excel class, but it's a simpler programming language, but there are conditionals. The conditionals look more like those ternary operators that we saw a few weeks ago. And you would use those ternary operators to say, if cell A and cell B is attached by a plus operator, add them. If not, kind of like we're doing in the switch case thing.
Well, I guess I'm saying, if you just end up with eval as the way to do it, at the end of it, then you don't have to test for anything.
That's correct. Yeah, take what is in there.
JavaScript can do the math.
JavaScript can do the math, and JavaScript, not only can JavaScript do the math, but the symbols that we're using to represent the operations are exactly the same symbols that JavaScript uses to execute the operations. And there's some magic that you could program in there, and I'll let you figure out how to do that. Does that make sense? But you're right. Two things have to be the case. One, that we have a symbol, for these operations, but in this case, they're actually the same symbol that JavaScript actually uses. In other words, if there's a plus in that string, use the plus. And all of these are exactly analogous. Minus is minus. Times is times. If we put an X in here, an X in that button, it would break, because JavaScript X is not multiplying. But we have a star, right? So you could put some logic in there that say, don't use the switch statement, evaluate what that operator is, and use it in context. Yeah, for order of operations. Right. So we cast the operands to numbers. We evaluate. This might not be the tersest way of doing it, but we evaluate the operator and then immediately apply it. Right? At that point, we know everything we need. We know the operation, and we know the two operands. And we apply it right there. And when we apply it, where do we apply it to? We assign its value to a variable that's local to our program. So we're only using a working variable in the context of this function, right? Because we're not quite yet ready to present it back to the home program yet. We're still computing the answer. So what more do we need to do to compute the answer? Well, if we get a giant number, we need to shrink it down so it fits in the display. So if we get a number that's more than 10 digits, we reduce it down. Right? So what we're doing is the length of the result is, remember, we have no decimals. I mean, we might by a divisor, but we're not really accounting for that. But if we have that length, it doesn't matter whether it's a decimal or not. If it's more than 10, then chop it. And then update the display, which is going to take the result and put it in the display. Right? It's going to take what? Update display, we've already programmed that. It takes the display text and puts it in the display. So results, remember, is just like a working area for this function. Nobody else could see it except inside this function. And it's used to come up with ultimately what we want the ultimate result to be. And we don't want that result to be pushed up to the page until we've done everything we need to do to operate on it. So it's not just adding the numbers or dividing them, it's also figuring out, are they too big to fit in the display? And if they are, let's truncate, essentially. Right? And that is all it is. Once you update the display, for the purposes of this program, you've computed the answer. You could flush your registers, or in this case, your variables. Now, if we're going to allow for another computation, in other words, a second operator, obviously you want to change some of this logic here. Does that make sense? And then this we've already gone through, right? This is a specific event handler. So, in other words, it responds in one way to one possible event, clicking on the equal sign. So, we don't need to iterate and apply the listener to a collection of elements. We apply it directly to the element that the enter button, which is the equal sign, right?
Step directed an anonymous function, and you could actually put two calculators on the page, and then have two separate JavaScript files. That's with the logic of both calculators. And then you can compare and track.
Yeah, and let me repeat it for the people at home there. So the last step is something we saw in the last project, and it's very simple. We take everything and just wrap it in the code of this pattern, and all of our code is in there. And like I said, that is sort of the way using function level scoping in JavaScript to ensure that everything we've named in our widget is pertaining to our widget. And there might be something else with the same name on the page, but it's not going to be affected by our program, hopefully, right? So, the question was, I'm sorry.
So it's actually, we have this.
Yeah.
The code works this calculator.
Right.
We want to go off and do another calculator.
Yeah, okay, so
it will be, you know, this way you can have it side by side on the same page. Right?
that's correct. So all this function does, let's see how we implement it on this page. We implement it by using this as its, well, we don't. So yes and no. So unlike yes and no, you know, we could have multiple calculators on the page. We would have to instantiate them in some way, right? Here we're instantiating explicitly in the HTML. You know, we create the HTML and then we hang this off of explicitly named elements in the HTML. So it won't be as easy to instantiate another calculator without already having the template of its elements on the page. In other words, it's different than the slideshow, which renders itself and its elements itself. In other words, instantiating a new slideshow puts the elements on the page. So, to answer your question, to make this truly modular, for those maybe some instances where you'd want multiple calculators on a page, which might happen, you would probably want to implement it where this is rendered by the widget itself, the HTML, so that you have control over what's on the page and how it's wired up to the functions of your widget, and you could differentiate. Does that make sense? So yeah, you're right. This is fully modular, other than the fact that the elements themselves are kind of hard-coded into the environment using HTML. And not part of the namespace of the widget itself. Until we bring them in by get elements by ID or get, or what was it, query selectors.
If structured, then you wired it. That's one strategy. The other one is make it all programmatically happen. That's the other strategy.
Right.
All programmatically happen. That's when you get two separate calculators.
Right. So if you want to be the next, Mark Zuckerberg, and you have an idea that you could build into a JavaScript widget, right? You can see the two differences in this example. The first example, all you have to do is ship that JavaScript file and put very simple instructions. Create a div, call whatever you want, and then somewhere in JavaScript create, var x equal new slideshow and pass it that div. And I'll do the rest. And that makes it very simple. The package is up, and you could say, you know what, I created 4 classes in there. You could style those however you want. I've given you some examples. In this case, for this calculator, it's a little bit more difficult to wire. Here's the JavaScript. Now you've got to create the HTML that interacts with that. Another way we could do it is to render that, and you already know how to do that from the slideshow. You just create HTML in a string and pass that to a DOM object as its inner HTML, and it becomes an element within that element. Right?
So you can put that whole thing in the
You can put it in a variable and say, var x is equal to inner text of whatever is already there.
Right.
That's pseudocode, by the way, but you know what I mean. So, yeah, rendering it helps. If you think about it, rendering it helps a little bit with keeping the page elements in the scope of your widget.
Someone else uses it, you don't have to worry.
It's a little bit easier to package. It's like, it's easier to package a website because there's only one address. An application, you got to put it on a CD and then tell people how to use it. It's a similar thing. If you could put a widget in one file and say, just put this on your, attach this to your page and give it a name of an element and it'll work. So 2 different approaches. They're 2 different things. You're doing 2 different things, but I think that should be clear in how they're different. Okay, 5 minutes before I.
I wasn't quite clear on why your last name is BCN.
That's a good question. So we never really use this. Well, we do. We use it. We use it. Yeah, we don't use it. We make it available to you so you could style this at your leisure.
If you were to use,
You're right.
the way you modify the appearance of CSS, the dot button.
We use a space button, which is referring to the tag, not the class.
So if you wanted to, how would you do it to get by
Well, you would do it, you have to refer to it as a class, so you have to refer to it with dot notation. So like, you know, like as a dot. So class in CSS, where am I? I'm mixed up. Like this. You could do dot button BTN.
you could say that, you could say either one of them.
Yeah. But if you do dot BTN, it'll take the numbers and the operators. And you want different event handlers for those. You know what I mean? So those selectors are available, but we don't use them in this program. And they wouldn't really be useful in the JavaScript of this program, the way it exists now. Any questions at all?
So you could fiddle around without the
Okay. So here, Noah wrote this example, and here, the button class is used for. So I didn't apply Twitter Bootstrap to our example, but button helps make it look like this.
Oh, that's a bad.
Yeah. So it's Bootstrap CSS that picks up the button class. Thank you, Noah. Some other words of wisdom from Noah. Let's see. It's probably wrapped in the class. That's a built-in type. Yeah, so that's another thing that I forgot to mention. I knew that. JSLint won't let you use eval. Yeah, so like I said, if you follow the same pattern of the render concept, it would be pretty easy to modularize this HTML structure. Questions? You do not need, so that's a good question. So let's look at this. So where's my page? Oop, I just deleted it. If I go here, I wish this thing would open in. So I don't have the whole page pasted in there yet, but if I view this in the browser, it's going to look like that without, you know, so all Bootstrap does in this case is apply some CSS rules, and primarily to the BTN class. Yeah, so watch this. If you go to the example page, right, we get out of here, class, and we go over here, and you can inspect these elements and see what rules are applied to BTN, and here they are, right? So this is on the hover pseudo cursor button, and here's some rules that apply to button, and some other rules that apply to button. So those all come for free with Twitter Bootstrap, if you want it to work like that. Yeah. Okay, I'm off duty in 2 minutes. Any other questions? Did anyone have a question on the forum about events that wasn't answered by this?
I never sorted it completely out, but I don't know if it's sorted.
And for what you're asking, it might be better to show us an example. You know, and that's fine. You know, okay, I can look at that.
I have one that has really nothing to do with JavaScript.
Okay.
Why did you look at, you know, I make a page or HTML, and I put it up on the website, and then I say, show me the source, and there's stuff in there that I didn't write.
HTML, what, like table, like a table body or things like
No,
that?
it's well, it's usually jamming in JavaScript stuff. Here on the
Yeah, I see that.
I see
So yeah.
browsers. It's like this weird junk in there that I suspect is on browsers.
Well, if a page, it tries to complete a page if it thinks there's something missing. Yeah, I mean, in some cases it'll do that. And in some cases, I've seen the JC student server add like just a character or two in weird places sometimes. But I've never seen, I mean, if you could show me an example, I'd be glad to see it.
It messes you up if you're iterating through the DOM. There's some elements set in there that you didn't put in there.
Yeah, so one thing you have to think about, yeah, you're right. There might be,
Source helps if you have a problem.
yeah, so iterating through the DOM, especially using like for in, is not good because there might be properties that apply to a DOM element that are not really children.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, I was trying to dig through my tables, like finding the table and then digging through the element element, and the table 1 was there, and I didn't know.
It was an element, yeah.
And I kept thinking, oh, I should be on.
And you didn't put that in there maybe, but the browser did? Yeah, so.
And until I made a source, I had no idea what.
Yeah, so the DOM is, while you created an HTML, the browser ultimately renders the DOM objects. Does that make sense? So, and it might take liberties. Different browsers might take liberties and say, you know, this guy forgot to close this tag. I'm going to do it for him. Or, you know, there's no ending body tag. So,
yeah, it's not usually something like, usually looks like something has been some other site that looks like it's been injected.
I've seen that too.
It's not like just little patches.
yeah, I'd have to see it specifically.
Yeah, I'm looking for one.
Yeah. There are times I've seen in playing with this example where you could kind of inject a whole DOM element into your DOM, and that could happen. You know, you could see doc type in your doc type, you know, in your document, and that's something that you know, as we get into jQuery, we're going to do a lot more DOM traversal, navigation, creation type of things. But you're right. You have the power as a JavaScript programmer to not only interact with the document that was downloaded to your site, but to change it and to even sort of create a new document within it or do dangerous things like that. Does that make sense? JavaScript gives you, you know, if you don't like the news, you can write some of your own. And think of that power. You know, you could, so if you don't like the array object, you could say, you know, var x is equal to array.prototype.concat.
But in the real world, it's pretty dangerous to be able to.
This is incredibly dangerous. And that's why I'm saying, as a JavaScript programmer, your universe is your web page, and that gives you a lot of power, but it also gives you a lot of responsibility. And your responsibility is to put together a page that makes sense for the reader. And in JavaScript, you could tear that page apart and turn it upside down. You saw us physically in the first project, flip it around, but you can literally put the body under the HTML. There's nothing to, you know what I'm saying? Right. You can make the body a child of, you can make HTML a child of body with one JavaScript line. And your browser's going to look at that and do something weird. It'll either try to fix it and create some recursive infinite loop or something. So the point I'm making is, the good news is you can't crash Amazon in JavaScript, unless you're really smart. You can't destroy something that you didn't build, but you're writing in a universe that is that web page, and you have a responsibility of keeping it intact if you want to use it effectively.
Somebody else who goes to your site and penetrate it and do all kinds of things off of your site that can destroy other people's things because you didn't do a very good job of building a moat around your
That's
site,
correct.
which is your website.
That's correct. If you don't, if you expose your JavaScript too much, other people can exploit some of your behaviors. And they could say, if you have a behavior that says, and it's at a global level, and it's a function that says, and you name it, insert a picture into my paragraph, right? And somebody sees that, you know, they do a view source on your page, and they say, you know what, I'm going to try to see if this function will work. Instead of putting a picture in there, I'm going to put some SQL code. Delete all from customers, and insert that into this guy's DOM and see what happens, right? And that type of stuff is SQL insertion can happen, right? So, so the techniques you're learning here, you know, this anonymous closure thing, it's not perfect, but it is, as we've seen, a way of making it a little bit more difficult, needing to know, you know, what the page is about before you can just go in and inspect it. You know, not putting your variables on a global level is sort of, you know, if you can learn that from this class, it's a good thing. You know, and even if you don't, that's fine. You know, there's not a lot of damage that can happen from exposing your slideshow as global variables, but you know, there's some, depending on what your site is. I mean, yeah.
The minute they can control and get back to your server, then you're in a world of hurt. I had one object before.
It's true. Yeah, I do too.
Doing
Yeah.
stuff from my server, my domain name, or my name.
Using you as a denial service, or using you as a PHP mailer, or
So I got blacklisted and the whole deal, and it had nothing to do with it, but somebody didn't, you know, do enough to build in some of these papers. So it's just, everybody's looking for a way in.
yeah. So exactly, things like that, global JavaScript variables, things, simple things, keeping up to date on your software. You know, if you use a CMS, you know, all those versions that come out every month they're mainly little security things to keep, you know, keep those .ru customers from destroying your site. You know, so those things, simple things are important. Right.
I don't know if you or Noah that recommended Blind to text editor, but the best I've tried in years. It's really great.
Really, I don't think it was. It wasn't me.
If you haven't tried done it yet, do it now. The Blind to text is the editor, and it text-based with a straight editor on Mac. And then you go to Windows or Linux. But the Blind to goes everywhere, and it takes text-mate and just does it another 10 steps. It's really very well done.
Cool. So I'll take a look at this. I'll put a link on our site.
Yeah, it's really good.
Okay, so project 4 I think is due like in a couple of weeks. Don't sweat the deadline yet, but you might want to get working on it. There's a couple of new lessons on the page. There's a lesson on, if you go to this like what's new area, there's a lesson on arrays, which we've covered a lot, but you know, a little bit more formal. This is what they are, and the concept of JSON, JavaScript object notation. We'll talk a little bit about that in Project 5. Project 5 will also start introducing jQuery, which we've used a little bit before, but get into how it works. So we'll see you guys next Tuesday. Sure.
Yeah, if I had another bracket for one second, if I put a function outside of that slideshow function.
Yeah, if it's outside of the function, you can refer to it.
That's, and then I can refer to all the methods